Democratic Congresswoman Ilhan Omar is now apologizing for tweets that members of both parties have denounced as anti-Semitic. She tweeted Sunday that money is the reason why U.S. politicians defend Israel, specifically calling out the pro-Israel lobbying group AIPAC, claiming it pays American leaders to be pro-Israel. Yesterday, Jewish members of the Democratic caucus sent a letter to House leadership, and though they did not mention their Minnesota colleague by name, they said they were, quote, deeply alarmed by the rhetoric that has, quote, disparaged us and called into question our loyalty to our nation. They also asked leadership to, quote, join us in calling on each member of the caucus to unite against anti-Semitism and hateful tropes and stereotypes. House leadership then released a statement. It reads, quote, anti-Semitism must be called out, confronted, and condemned whenever it is encountered without exception. We are and will always be strong supporters of Israel in Congress because we understand that our support is based on shared values and strategic interests. Legitimate criticism of Israel's policies is protected by the values of free speech and democratic debate that the United States and Israel share. But Congresswoman Omar's use of anti-Semitic tropes and prejudicial accusations about Israel's supporters is deeply offensive. We condemn these remarks and we call upon Congresswoman Omar to immediately apologize for these hurtful comments. As Democrats and as Americans, the entire Congress must be fully engaged in denouncing and rejecting all forms of hatred, racism, and prejudice and discrimination wherever they are encountered. The apology from Congresswoman Omar came soon after, tweeting, quote, listening and learning, but standing strong. She linked her statement, saying in part, anti-Semitism is real, and I am grateful for Jewish allies and colleagues who are educating me on the painful history of anti-Semitic tropes. She said that she unequivocally apologizes. Also adding, quote, at the same time, I reaffirm the problematic role of lobbyists in our politics, whether it be AIPAC, the NRA, or the fossil fuel industry. Republicans are now calling on the House Speaker to remove Omar from the Foreign Affairs Committee. Wow. Joe, what do you think?
Well, the apology could have been a bit more unequivocal.
Yeah.
Comparing people who defend the right of Israel to exist
in the NRA
to her stated enemies in the NRA and the fossil fuel industry is not exactly what you would call an unequivocal apology. You know, she's made statements before that have caused concerns. We'll see if she makes statements again. But no, that was not the type of apology, unfortunately, that would have been helpful for not only her career, but also for the career or for the Democratic Party, and in fact for healing in this country. Because with Donald Trump's vicious rhetoric attacking Muslim Americans, it's more important than ever. I would say, as someone who really wants Muslim Americans to prove Donald Trump wrong every day, this was sort of distressing, to say the least. Her apology was distressing. I hope she takes another swing at it and is more unequivocal in her apology. But Noah, you cannot use the word unequivocal when talking about what Nancy Pelosi and the House leadership did. My God, that was one of the strongest statements. Britt Hume called it strong medicine. I don't know that I can remember an entire leadership team putting out a statement that strongly condemning a member of their own caucus, Republican or Democrat.
It was strong and it was desirable. Unfortunately for Representative Omar, this is the second apology for anti-Semitic remarks in as many months. She had previously said that Israel had hypnotized the world and defended those comments, said, I don't know what's especially wrong with them or offensive about them. She got an education, apologized, and has since stepped on another landmine. The reason why Democrats have not applied the Northam standard here is because it would be much more broadly applied. The Northam standard is essentially a pretty morally unambiguous stand that says any act of bigotry or prejudice attributable to ignorance or social desirability bias or otherwise, no matter how long ago it happened, is intolerable. The reason why they cannot apply this to Omar in this case is, one, it would truncate the caucus, but B, it would be applied to Representative Rashida Tlaib, who said that American representatives in the Republican conference are guilty of having a dual loyalty, essentially, by saying they forgot what country they represent in defense of a BDS resolution against an organization that tries to delegitimize Israeli institutions, public and private, that they have members, including Maxine Waters, who's a committee chair, who have a relationship with Minister Louis Farrakhan, who is an outright anti-Semite, and that they've just recently abandoned the Democratic National Committee, just recently dissociated from the Women's March, which is staffed by at least 2 individuals who were engaged in an anti-Semitic row just 2 months ago. So this is a bigger problem than I think Representative Omar. And the statement, while saying that, you know, she apologized and we fully accept her apology, is an attempt to get out of a bad news cycle, not necessarily to achieve, as you say, healing and reconciliation.
Well, you know, though, Willie, again, it was about as strong of a statement as I've seen. I haven't seen the Republicans stand united against Donald Trump's anti-Muslim comments, against Donald Trump's defense of neo-Nazis, against Donald Trump's moral equivocation on white supremacists, on Donald Trump's attacking an Indiana judge because his parents were from Mexico, saying that he could not be unfair. All of the racist garbage. I've never heard the Republican Party once united in any of those instances. We saw that yesterday, and we also have seen Nancy Pelosi push back against some of the well, let's just say we've seen her push back time and again when people have tried to drag the party too far out of the center.
Yeah, we've seen individual Republicans come out in the moment in Charlottesville, or in the moment during the proposed Muslim ban during the campaign, and condemn it, but as you say, not a concerted effort from the party like we saw yesterday. But Congresswoman Omar also has expressed sympathy and support for the BDS movement, which is to boycott, divest, and sanction Israel, put economic pressure on Israel. So this is not a one-off tweet. This is part of a pattern, which is why it's gotten the outrage of so many people. And Susan Page, it's an interesting dynamic to watch Nancy Pelosi manage this new caucus. You know, she sort of poured some cold water on the Green New Deal movement. She sort of tamped down talk of impeachment, and now dealing with this with Congresswoman Omar.
Yeah, we still are in a sorting out process, I think, in terms of this interesting new generation of House freshmen who have been pretty assertive or very self-confident. Nancy Pelosi has been deferential to them in a way. They've gotten some good committee assignments. She's put some freshman members of Congress as chairs of subcommittees. That's not something that happens every time around. But she is also exerting her control on issues like this. And I think the Democrats have been trying to make a very clear contrast with President Trump when it comes to expressions of outrage and opposition when members do things like acknowledge having worn blackface or repeat stereotypes, damaging stereotypes about Jewish people, or are accused of sexual misconduct. Sometimes it's hard, you know. You end up pushing back against members of the Congress or the Democratic Party who are either important or maybe about to be important. But I think it is one effect. I think it's one effect of the Trump administration that Democrats feel that this is something they need to do. They need to have a really clear contrast.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and you know, Mika, it's so interesting also. I didn't hear Kevin McCarthy or any of the Republicans, any Republican senators, any Republican House members attacking Donald Trump during his campaign with his anti-Semitic tropes. Remember the Star of David next to Hillary Clinton? Do you remember that? Do you remember the other anti-Semitic tropes that he flirted with that throughout the campaign? Do you remember that?
Yep.
Look at that.
Sure
I'm sorry.
do.
Let's keep that up for a second. Let's keep that up for a second. Do we have, hey, Alex, could you show us a side-by-side criticism of Kevin McCarthy with Donald Trump when He did that anti-Semitic trope. Do you have that? Do we have that on file?
We could, but one side would be blank if we did. So.
Yeah, because there
what
was
about
not
Paul
one.
Ryan? Did we have Paul Ryan or Mitch McConnell? Do we have a side-by-side on that? Because I'd love to see the attacks when Donald Trump made an anti-Semitic attack against Hillary Clinton. Do we have that side-by-side?
Not ready. We'll look to see if any are available.
Could you look for that?
Yeah.
Because it would be really good. Because there's some other anti-Semitic tropes, obviously, that Donald Trump did during the campaign. And of course, I don't know, Mika. I'm crazy. I'm just kind of crazy. But I think when you preach moral equivocation between neo-Nazis and those who are opposing neo-Nazis, that's sort of anti-Semitic as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
One final thought, too. While we keep talking about Ralph Northam, I mean, it just occurred to me last night while watching this rally, there just can be no moral equivocation between Democrats or Republicans. Democrats have to be able to talk about Charlottesville in 2020 without Ralph Northam being governor there, a Democratic governor. He's not leaving, okay, Democrats? He's not leaving. You need to kick him out of his party. You need to kick him out of his party this week. Let him govern as an independent between now and 2020. But you cannot have that man who still doesn't get it sitting as a Democratic governor in a swing state. Kick him out of your party this week. I know you've all condemned him. You've done all the right things. He ain't leaving. If you can't impeach him, kick him out of the Democratic Party this week. There can be no moral equivocation when running against Donald Trump in any state in 2020. And in this conversation, Ralph Northam's name's come up 2 or 3 times. He can no longer be a Democrat. He needs to be kicked out of the party.
Still ahead, the president has threatened to sue a former aide who published an insider account of his time in the Trump administration. Now that former aide has beaten the president to the punch. Cliff Sims, the author of Team of Vipers, joins us next on Morning Joe.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.